Well, hello, Renaissance fans. We're going to go over chapter 11, a chapter 11 overview of the Bob Jones text on the Renaissance era. And I'm going to provide you with a bit of a framework so that you can kind of know where people are chronologically and where they are geographically. And I think that helps knowing who's who, who's where, and when, so it's a little bit easier to figure out who influences whom. But speaking of great works of art, I draw your attention to these samples, three of many, many more, of Steve Originals. These are acrylic pours by Stephen Gleason, brilliantly done, and you can look them up on the gram at Steve Originals or hashtag Steve Originals. Okay, now this Renaissance, there are a couple of ways of looking at the Renaissance. One is chronologically, what happened when? And another way to look at it is geographically, which is what happened where. And so the first way I want to look at the Renaissance chronologically is by looking at the Proto-Renaissance, the early Renaissance, and the High Renaissance. Now, the dates vary depending on which scholar or which authority you're talking to, and that's typical of just about any event in history when historians get together and start chopping things up. Historian A likes to say from this date to this date, and historian B will find slightly different dates and so on. So these are approximate. These are not hard set. Okay, everybody, we're in the early Renaissance now. These are periods of time that capture these transitions that are ongoing. And so 1300 to 1400 we're going to call the Proto-Renaissance. From about 1400 to 1500 we're going to call the Early Renaissance. And from about 1500, maybe a little before, to about 1550, we're going to call that the High Renaissance. And those three periods give you a few places to start pegging some of these very important artists. Now, one of them, going back to the Proto-Renaissance, this is the era of Giotto. Now, you've seen Giotto's Madonna, and you've seen how he took figures that were sometimes drawn in almost a flat, uh, stiff, wooden-looking format, how he has been able to add touches of shading to make human facial features seem more realistic, and how he's made these human figures look more human, and how he's made clothing look more like clothing, more with its texture, its wrinkles, its draping, and so on. And one of Giotto's great works is the Scrovini Chapel in Padua, Italy. And this chapel that you see here is just gloriously magnificent. This is I would love to visit this chapel someday, but the if you look down the sides of this chapel, you'll see that there are these individual portraits, individual events portrayed from the Bible. So a large number of what I hope would be familiar Bible stories are portrayed by Giotto on either side of this chapel. Now, moving to the early Renaissance, this is the time of the great genius Brunelleschi. You remember Brunelleschi? He's the one who figured out the rules of perspective. How do we take a two-dimensional canvas and put an image on it that looks three-dimensional? Well, he's the smart guy who figured that out. But Brunelleschi was also an architect, and one of the things he's known for is his dome at Florence. Now, when he built this dome in the era of the early Renaissance, this was the largest dome built in Europe since the Romans. And with the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of knowledge of their engineering capability unfortunately went with it. And these guys knew arches, they knew domes, they knew their stuff. And Brunelleschi comes along and is appointed uh, to be the man to design and create this great dome in Florence, Italy. Domes are extremely difficult to build because as you build this thing, you've got to have the structuring, you've got to have the scaffolding on a structure that is increasing in weight and is moving further and further away from its base and its foundation as you begin to finish it towards the middle. Well, how do you do that without the thing collapsing? And Brunelleschi figured it out, and he created what was, for a time, the largest dome since Roman days. Now, the next up is the High Renaissance. And the High Renaissance, so-called because you have the big guys, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Raphael. And so I want to take a moment to look at the best known portrait in the universe, and this is the Mona Lisa. And I think, and I hope, the more you look at this picture, I hope the more you appreciate the extraordinary beauty and finesse of this. Mona Lisa is extraordinary for a few reasons. One, she's not royalty. She's the subject of this painting, most scholars agree, is in fact the wife of a modest Italian merchant. Not anybody particularly famous, not anybody particularly powerful, not a Medici, not a Habsburg, just an ordinary middle-class woman. Now, another thing that's interesting about this portrait is the way that that she is featured. Most portraits of this era were simply profiles, just these very static, very stiff side views, almost looking like mugshots. And what Da Vinci has done here is he is the one who has taken this mugshot view and turned it to a three-quarter view. Basically, your yearbook pose was invented by Leonardo da Vinci when he painted the Mona Lisa. And so this is the pose that people often prefer to be photographed in. And so the next time you get a yearbook picture taken, it's probably going to be a three-quarter pose, and you can remember, oh, this was Da Vinci's idea, at least pretty much. At least he was one of the first to put this in painting. Now I'm going to expand the picture a little bit. And what I want you to notice here is something really interesting about Leonardo's genius. Someone suggested that he was so knowledgeable about how the human eye perceives things that I want you to see this with your own eyes. Now, look directly at the Mona Lisa's smile, and you'll notice that it looks a little bit flat when you're looking directly at her smile. Now, if you glance up to one of the corners of the painting, you'll notice her smile changes a little bit and becomes a little more pronounced as you look away. And some speculate that Da Vinci's knowledge of human eye perception was so good that he deliberately incorporated that feature into his painting. Another thing about this is the tone of her skin looks natural. In this day and age, you didn't go to Hobby Lobby to buy your paint. If you were an artist, you actually made your own paint, and you determined what the pigments were going to be. You determined what else was going to go into it. And using a particular technique that Da Vinci invented by himself, he found a way to make the skin on the portrait of this woman look translucent, to look natural. It has highs and it has lows, and it seems to reflect light in a natural way. So this was really quite an accomplishment. Okay, now another way to look at the Renaissance is geographically, and so we have a Southern Renaissance. And what do you suppose the other one would be? That's right, the Northern Renaissance. And you can think of Southern and Northern like this. The Renaissance begins in Italy, principally in the city of Florence. And so the Southern Renaissance means essentially Italy. The Northern Renaissance simply means anything outside of Italy, where you also run into some really great artists. Now, one of them is Jan van Eyck, and he is painting this portrait of a couple getting engaged. This is a betrothal picture. It's one of Van Eyck's very famous portraits, and and it's actually in the National Gallery in Washington D.C. We actually have this painting. Now, Van Eyck was from the Netherlands, and that is sort of like Holland. So he's sort of in that region near Belgium, and this is why he is, of course, a Northern Renaissance artist. And one of the details in this painting you'll notice is a dog, and the dog is a symbol of loyalty. So that's why it's appropriate to have a picture of this little dog in this painting commemorating a betrothal and an engagement to be married. Now, next up is another Northern Renaissance artist. We've already looked at some of his stuff, Albrecht Dürer. And Dürer, you remember, was a personal friend of Martin Luther. And Dürer is Northern Renaissance because he comes from Nuremberg. Not Nuremberg, Germany, but Nuremberg, Holy Roman Empire. It's the same city, but there's no Germany at this point. Just like there's not really in Italy at this time. There's a number of different Italian states. There's the Holy Roman Empire, but it's not going to be until the beginning of the late 19th, early 20th century that we have, late 19th century that we have Germany as we know it and Italy as we know it. Remember, European geography is forever changing. Now, in this particular picture, you have Dürer's self-portrait made when he was 26 years old, and the portrait, as you look more and more closely at it, you'll notice just the extraordinary detail with which he painted. And you see it in the clothing, you see it on his own features as you look more closely at the painting, and you'll see it in the things around him, things in the background. This man was an extraordinarily gifted artist. Okay, so that, I hope, gives you at least a little bit of an understanding to see that you can look at the Renaissance chronologically, Proto-Renaissance, Early Renaissance, High Renaissance, and you can look at the Renaissance geographically, the Southern Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance. Alrighty, so see you later.